Wolf on the Fold by Judith Clarke, reading Chapter 2, The City of Love. 1957. On a morning in the last weeks of the summer holidays, the phone rang in Frances and Clytie's house. They'd only had the phone connected last November, so it was still new and thrilling to hear it ringing from the hall. Wherever she was, Clytie would come running, heart-pounding, hoping the call would be for her, because it could be Charlie Grace, the clever, dark-eyed boy who sat across the aisle in maths class. It could be that he'd thought of her in these long, dull weeks with nothing much to do, picked up the phone book and searched along the columns for her name. Once she'd glanced up from her algebra and found him gazing at her. The moment their eyes met, he'd looked away. It could be him, Clytie thought, whenever she heard the phone. Her younger sister Frances came running too, getting under Clytie's feet, hovering when Clytie picked up the receiver, eyes wide, listening in. "It's not going to be for you," hissed Clytie, her hand over the mouthpiece. "Who's going to ring a 10-year-old? "Oh," said Frances, and stayed there, her feet skipping on the carpet in a nervous little dance. Frances was scared of the telephone. It sounded so shrill, so urgent, she couldn't help expecting bad news to come along the wire. She wasn't sure what kind exactly. Something dreadful, certainly, a cold, sepulchral voice, whispering words that would send their lives tumbling like skittles in a bowling alley. Frances was afraid of everything. She didn't know why she was like that. Sometimes she thought a bad fairy had been present at her christening, bringing the invisible gift of a sinking heart. "What are you standing there for?" demanded Clytie. "Go away." If the call was Charlie Grace, Frances would be the biggest nuisance. She'd want to know who it was and what they said, and then she'd probably blab to Mum. "Go away." Frances stayed. Clytie gave up. "Hello," she said into the telephone. "What? Pardon? What did you say? Ethel? There's no Ethel here." She listened for a moment longer, then shrugged her shoulders and handed the phone to Frances. Frances edged away. "Who is it?" she whispered. "I don't know, do I?" answered Clytie crossly. "Here, you see for yourself. Go on." She grinned unkindly, thrusting the phone at Frances. "It won't bite, you know. It's only some old lady. She's got the wrong number, I think." Frances took the shiny black receiver and held it to her ear. The voice she heard was quavery and sounded very far away. "I'm coming to visit," the voice told Frances. "In a day or two. I'm coming to see Ethel." "Ethel?" echoed Frances, just as Clytie had done. "We don't have an Ethel. Do you mean Irene? We have an Irene. She's my mum. Do you want to talk to Irene Sinclair?" The little voice grew more distant and crackles sounded between the words. "Friend," Frances caught. "Best friend," and then Ethel again, and finally, "Is Irene there?" "I'll get her for her," said Frances, but Clytie was already doing it. "Mum!" she yelled out down the hall. "Mum, there's an old lady on the phone who wants to talk to you." "That was your great Aunt May," their mother told them as she put the phone down. "She's coming for a visit at the end of the week." In a lower voice, almost as if she was talking to herself, Irene added, "It will give poor Cousin Patty a break." "A break from what?" asked Clytie. But before Irene had a chance to reply, Frances interrupted. "She said she was coming to see her best friend Ethel." "Oh, she won't be able to do that," answered Irene. "Ethel passed away years ago." "Passed away? You mean died? Doesn't Auntie May know?" "Oh, yes," replied her mother, "only she's forgotten, I expect." "How could you forget your best friend had died?" wondered Frances, and she was just about to ask when Clytie demanded, "Where's she going to sleep?" She knew the answer to that, of course. She'd known it the minute the visit had been mentioned. Auntie May would sleep in Frances's small room, and Frances would move in with Clytie on the old camp bed that they kept beneath the house. It happened every time they had a visitor. "I hate sleeping in the same room with Frances," she grizzled to Irene. "I never get any sleep. She talks to herself. She whispers on and on and on." "No, I don't," said Frances quickly. "Yes, you do. Whisper, whisper, whisper," mimicked Clytie cruelly. "You sound like a live mouse someone's wrapped up in tissue paper, scrabbling and scrabbling, trying to get out." "I do not," cried Frances, her face turning hot and pink. "Whispering?" echoed Irene wonderingly. What do you whisper about, Frances? Nothing. I mean, it's stuff for school, things I have to learn by heart. No, it isn't, crowed Clytie. It is. Irene sighed and left them to it, escaping to the kitchen. Isn't. They could keep it up for hours. Oh well, sighed Irene, and set about the breakfast dishes, clattering them extra loudly to drown out the shouting in the hall. It is so things I have to learn for school, Frances was shrieking. Course it's not little fibber, as if primary school kid has to learn stuff in the Christmas holidays. Clytie's eyes narrowed, fixing on her sister's face. I know, it's... Frances froze, waiting. Did Clytie know what she whispered? She might. Clytie always found your worst, most shameful secrets. It's something to do with you being such a little scaredy cat, said Clytie. And then Frances saw she didn't really know. Otherwise, she'd have said so, right out loud. That's what Clytie did with secrets. You're a baby, sneered Clytie, scared of everything. I am not, mimicked Clytie. That's what babies say. Frances felt hot tears gathering in her eyes. I hate you, she burst out, and I hate you. I wish I'd never had a sister, cried Frances. Not one like you, anyway. Her head whirling, her stomach churning, she spun away from Clytie and ran down the hall, out the back door, across the yard, through the gap in the fence and down the lane. Clytie stood still for a moment, and then she ran too, up the hall and out the front door, along the path and through the gate, across the park and to the streets on the other side. They ran and ran till somehow the anger melted and they turned back home again, where for a little while they spoke to each other in strange, polite voices which didn't sound real, as if they were distant acquaintances meeting in the street. As she ran, thoughts whirled and tumbled round in Frances's head, like clothes spinning inside Mum's washer. Trust Clytie to remember about the whispering, even though it was a full 6 months since Frances had last shared her room. What Clytie didn't know, what no one knew and never would if Frances could help it, was how that whispering was prayers. Frances couldn't get to sleep at night until she'd said a prayer for everyone, not only for her mum and dad and sister, but for all their relatives and friends and neighbours and the kids at school and their mums and dads and sisters and brothers, so nothing bad would happen to them. She prayed to keep the world safe too, from wars and plagues and famines, from floods and hurricanes and fires, tidal waves. The long, long list kept Frances wide awake and whispering for hours. And always, just when she thought she'd finished, sunk her head down on the pillow and pulled the blankets up, she'd think of something else, like a meteorite hurtling downwards from the sky, a huge knobbly piece of some far-off planet crashing down towards the earth. Then she'd have to start again, whispering to keep the meteorite away. At breakfast there were shadows underneath her eyes, and the box of cornflakes felt so heavy it might have been filled with stones. It was all part of being a coward, Frances knew. She hated being such a scaredy cat. Look how she made Dad stop the car whenever they came to a bridge so she could walk across on tiptoe, because she was scared the bridge would fall if she was in the car. When she reached the other side, everyone was cranky with her except for Dad. You'll grow out of it, he promised. But how long would it take her? She was almost 11. This year she'd be in 6th class, the next year in high school, and on the way to high school the bus passed over a bridge. She'd never told them about the prayers, not even Dad. It was too embarrassing. It was stupid, thought Frances, hating herself. Stupid and small and weak. She hated Clytie more, though. Clytie, who was never scared of anything. She hated every little thing about her sister, the shape of her telltale mouth, the mean green shade of her sneaky eyes, the brisk, brave swing of her sandy hair. 3 blocks away, lopping down Marylands Road, long-legged Clytie was hating Frances too. Auntie May was ancient and sprightly and very, very small. So small she must buy her clothes in the children's department, thought Clytie scornfully. Her frilly pastel frocks would look great on a 6-year-old. She wore sand shoes on her tiny feet and bright white tennis socks, their cuffs turned neatly down. It didn't take long for them to figure out why Cousin Paddy had needed a break. On the very first night of her visit, they'd found Auntie May in the kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, grey smoke billowing, frying sausages in a pan. "I'm getting the tea on," she told them happily, as they clustered around the door. "Patty's getting hungry, and Stan will be home from work any tick of the clock. See how dark it is outside? Must be nearly 6. I can't think what I could have been about, letting the time run away with me like that." Stan had been Auntie May's husband a very long time ago. He'd died years before Frances and Clytie were born. "She's loony," Clytie said to her father a few days later. "Isn't she, Dad?" "Confused," Kenny told her. "It happens to very old people sometimes. Their memories go." This sounded terrible to Frances. "Will I be like that when I'm old?" she cried. "You're so selfish," sneered Clytie. "Always thinking about yourself." Frances ignored her. "Will I, Dad?" It pained Kenny to think of his younger daughter grown old without him there to keep an eye on her. He gave Frances a quick, warm hug. "You'll be fine," he said, hoping she would be. "What about me?" demanded Clytie, forgetting all about selfishness. "Will I be fine too?" Kenny grinned at her. "You'll be the terror of the neighbourhood." "Auntie was out in the street with her shopping bag last night," said Frances. "We heard the gate creak and we looked out the windows and saw her. We had to run out in our pyjamas and bring her back inside," added Clytie. "She told us she was going to the butcher's to get some more sausages for Stan's tea." "Oh dear," sighed Irene. "At least she's forgotten about visiting her friend Ethel," said Frances. "Thank goodness for that," replied Irene. But Frances had spoken too soon. At lunch on Saturday, when her dad said, "Another cup of tea, Auntie? I think there's just one left in the pot," their great-aunt replied briskly, "Thank you, Kenny, but not for me," pushing her chair back and got up from the table. "I have to get going now," she told them. "I'll pop into my glad rags, then I'll be off." "Glad rags?" whispered Clytie. "What are glad rags?" No one answered her. Irene put down her teacup. "Going somewhere, Auntie?" she asked uneasily. "Only over to Ethel's place, dear." "Ethel's place?" They froze. "Ethel?" prompted Clytie, ignoring her mother's warning glance. "Oh yes, it's Saturday, isn't it? I always pop over to Ethel's on a Saturday afternoon." And before any of them could say a word, Auntie May had slipped from the kitchen and was halfway up the hall. From the room that had been Frances's, they heard the sound of wire hangers being pushed along the wardrobe rail. "We'll have to tell her," said Kenny. "We can't let her go all the way over there and find—" "No, Ethel," finished Clytie heartlessly. Taps were flowing in the bathroom now, and a snatch of song drifted down the hall. "She might forget," said Clytie. "You know how she does. When she's in there putting her glad rags on, she might come out all dressed up and not remember what she's dressed up for." "Clytie, well, she might." But when Auntie May came swishing from the bathroom in her best mauve dress with the posy of artificial violets tucked into the belt, her wild white hair held neatly by a purple Alice band, she hadn't forgotten a thing. "Toodaloo, I'm off," she warbled, waggling her fingers at them. "Don't wait up for me, I could be very late. Ethel and I always have a lot of catching up to do." "Auntie," said Irene. "Auntie, just a moment." "Yes?" Auntie May peeped back round the door. "What is it, Irene?" The old lady's bright, happy face upset Irene. She couldn't think how to begin. Kenny got up from the table. "Auntie," he said gently, taking her tiny, wrinkled hand. "Auntie, there's something we have to tell you." Auntie May sobbed as if her heart would break. They'd never seen anyone cry so much. Big, splashy tears streamed down her cheeks and soaked into the tablecloth. Even Clytie felt sorry for her. Poor thing, she thought. And she looked quite sweet all dressed up. That mauve dress was really pretty with its little bunch of violets at the waist. It was a pity about the sand shoes, but perhaps when you were very old, all you wanted was something comfortable on your feet. "Why didn't anyone tell me Ethel had passed away?" demanded Auntie May. She'd quite forgotten how she had been told all those years ago, and how she'd travelled across the city for the funeral. She opened her handbag, took out her hanky, and blew her nose, and then shook her head briskly, like a person stepping from a swimming pool. "So Ethel never got to Paris," she said sadly. "Paris?" "Ethel wanted to see Paris before she died. The city of love, she called it." "The city of love," echoed Clytie, and saw a city bathed in misty light, smelled flowers in the air, pictured narrow cobbled lanes where you walked in the evening, holding someone's hand. "The city of love," she repeated dreamily, and Frances glanced at her sharply, surprised there was no trace of a giggle in her sister's voice. Auntie May dropped the folded hanky into her bag and clicked the clasp shut firmly. Then she pushed her chair back and got to her feet again. "Well, I'll be off then." "Off? Where to?" asked Irene faintly. "Over to Ethel's place." Shockwaves rippled around the table. But Auntie," protested Irene. "Ethel's dead," snapped Auntie May. "I know, you told me just now." She glared at her niece. "I may be getting on, Irene, but I haven't lost my marbles yet. I'm popping across to see Ethel's house again, for old time's sake." "Oh, Auntie," Irene sounded as if she was about to cry. "I'm afraid the old house is gone too," Kenny told her. "They pulled it down a couple of years back, built a big electrical store there." "Electrical store?" "You know," explained Irene, "one of those places that sells toasters and irons and fridges and—" "I know what an electrical store is, thank you, Irene." Auntie May sat down at the table again, her black eyes sharp and businesslike. "Did you say this store sold fridges?" "Well, yes. Now that's something I have to get before I go back home. A new fridge for Patty. Her old one's on the blink, leaking all over the floor. I thought I'd get her one as a surprise. One of those new Kelvinators with a little freezer at the top." She beamed around the table. Ethel seemed quite forgotten. Frances's prayers kept her awake even longer now. She had to wait till Clytie was asleep before she could begin, and she had new prayers too, ones for Auntie May that she wouldn't burn their house down or wander off into the night. "And please, God, don't let her remember Ethel again and get dressed up to visit," whispered Frances, and then stopped, hearing the soft creak of a door and the brisk patter of her great-aunt's feet scampering down the hall. Off to get the tea for Stan, decided Frances, but the footsteps went right past the kitchen and out onto the back veranda. Now the laundry door squeaked, passing over the bulge in the linoleum. A long time passed. Could Auntie May have gone out? You could get out that way, through the laundry and across the backyard, over the fence and out onto the lane. Was she going to Ethel's place, or just anywhere? Frances imagined her great-aunt strolling down the road, round the corner, across Woodville Road. She'd walk and walk and walk, thought Frances, crossing roads and railway lines and bridges, walk and walk until something really big got in her way, something she couldn't climb over or pass around, like a river, or if she travelled far enough, the sea. And then she got out of bed and tiptoed down the hall, across the back veranda to the laundry. She pushed the door open. The light was on in there and taps were flowing. The tub brimmed with sudsy water dripping to the floor. Auntie May was piling wet clothes into the laundry basket. Frances splashed across the lino and turned the taps off. "What are you doing, Auntie?" "What does it look like?" retorted her great-aunt, hoisting the laden basket up onto her hip. "Open the door for me, will you? There's a good girl." "But get a move on, will you? I haven't got all day." Frances drew the bolt back and followed Auntie May across the lawn towards the clothesline. She helped hang out the dripping clothes. Clytie was going to be hopping mad. Auntie May had washed her best pink satin blouse, the one with the label which said "dry cleaning only." When they'd finished, Auntie May wiped her damp hands on the front of her nightie, then looked up and smiled at the big round moon. "Lovely washing day," she crowed delightfully. Frances stared at her. Her auntie looked so happy, as if being all muddled up wasn't scary, but the grandest fun. Turning the night into day, stepping in and out of time like a little girl in a storybook, bringing dead people to life again and expecting them home for tea. "What are you doing out of bed so late, Frances?" asked Auntie sternly, making one of her curious little leaps back into their ordinary life. "It's way past midnight, you know. What do you think you're doing out here in the garden in your pyjamas?" "Oh, I don't sleep very much," stumbled Frances. "Don't sleep much? Nonsense. You're a growing girl." And suddenly, without in the least having meant to, Frances found herself telling Auntie May all about those prayers which kept her whispering so late. It was quite safe to tell her, because Auntie May wouldn't tell anyone else. In half an hour, 10 minutes perhaps, her great-aunt would have forgotten the entire conversation. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Aunt May when Frances had finished telling. "You'd better cut down on that, Frances. You don't want to get to the pearly gates and have him say, 'Here's that child who kept me up all night listening to her jabber.' One good prayer will be enough." "What one?" asked Frances. Aunt May thought for a moment. Then she said, "Angels and ministers of grace, defend us." "Will that be enough? It sounds so short. Covers everything, though, doesn't it? And everyone." It did too, Frances realised when she'd thought about it for a bit. It sounded right. "Oh, thank you," she said gratefully, throwing her arms around her great-aunt, giving her a giant hug. "No need to get carried away, child," Auntie May made a small shooing motion with her hand. "Off to bed with you now." "And you too, Auntie. You're going to bed, aren't you, and not anywhere else?" Auntie May stared up at the moon again. "May as well have a nap," she said, "before Stan gets home for tea." They went into the house together. "Angels and ministers of grace defend us," whispered Frances, climbing back into bed, and she fell asleep the instant her head touched the pillow, as she always would from that night on. Clytie was sunbathing. She lay on a towel spread over the prickly buffalo grass, wearing her new black Speedo costume, her long limbs coated with copper tone, and a clownish white blob of zinc cream on her nose. Her eyes were closed. She was thinking about clever, dark-eyed Charlie Grace. That time in algebra when she'd caught him looking at her, when he'd turned away, the back of his neck had flushed bright red. That meant something, surely. Though Charlie Grace had never actually spoken to her, Clytie was almost certain he felt the same way she did. Whenever she caught sight of him unexpectedly across the playground, she flushed too, and a dizzy, weightless feeling swept over her. She felt she could leave the ground and float upwards, away into the sky. Footsteps crunched across the prickly grass. Clytie opened her eyes and saw her little sister standing beside her. She was wearing her swimming costume, a droopy, babyish thing, which should have been thrown out years ago. A towel was draped across her arm. "How come you're here?" Clytie demanded crossly. Frances blinked at her. "To sunbathe," she answered, and began to spread her towel flat on the grass. "Why do you always have to copy me? Why do you always have to do everything I do?" "I don't. I thought of sunbathing too when I woke up this morning. It was the first thing Fibber," snapped Clytie, and closed her eyes, shutting Frances from her sight. Now she wouldn't be able to think about Charlie Grace. She never could when anyone else was around. You needed privacy for that kind of thing, and Frances had no idea of privacy. She followed you everywhere. Clytie stole a quick glance at her sister from beneath her lashes. Little pest. There she was, settling down on her towel, only inches away when she knew very well she wasn't welcome. Clytie scowled, as if the little pest had thought of sunbathing the minute she woke up. Frances didn't need to sunbathe. She had their mum's smooth olive skin, which never freckled or turned red and peeled, which turned brown naturally all by itself. She didn't need blobs of zinc cream on her nose. Frances had natural blonde hair too, a pale gold honey colour instead of the sandy shade Clytie had gotten from Dad. It didn't seem fair. Blonde hair and lovely skin were wasted on Frances. There was no Charlie Grace in her life. She was only 10, too young to be interested in boys. Frances lay down and closed her eyes quickly before she began to cry. Clytie was so mean to her, always, mean as anything. She had thought of sunbathing this morning, so there. Clytie never believed her. "Clytie, Frances, Clytie!" Their mother was standing on the veranda. She was wearing fresh lipstick and she'd changed into another dress. "Are you going out?" asked Frances. "Just over to Mrs. Privet's place for a few minutes," her mother answered breezily. A few minutes? It was never that. "Keep an eye on Auntie for me, will you?" said Irene. "What?" Clytie and Frances sprang to their feet, mouths falling open in round, horrified shapes. "Mum, you can't go off and leave us alone with her. Anything might happen. We wouldn't know what to do." "I'll be back in no time," promised Irene. They didn't believe her for a moment. Once Mum got gabbing with Mrs. Privet. "Your auntie's having her nap. She won't be awake for hours." "But Mum—" It was no use. Irene darted back inside the house. They heard the tap of her high heels hurrying up the hall, the bang of the front door. She'd gone. They looked at each other and then, without a word, tiptoed to their great-aunt's room and peeped around the door. She was asleep, her white hair spread out on the pillow, the hump she made beneath the eiderdown small as a little child's. "Imagine," murmured Clytie in a soft, unexpected voice. "She was once a kid like us, who went to school and stuff." It seemed barely possible, astonishing. "And," Clytie went on in that same surprising voice, "she was a girl who fell in love, who got engaged. She had a wedding, think of it, with bridesmaids and confetti. She was a bride in a wedding gown and orange blossom and—" Frances stared at her sister. It was strange to hear hard-hearted Clytie talking in this soft, dreamy way. Frances giggled nervously and said, "Do you think she wore her sand shoes at her wedding?" It was the kind of remark Clytie herself might have made, but when Frances did, Clytie flushed and got annoyed. "You're such a baby," she sneered, and stalked out to the backyard. Frances followed. They lay on their towels side by side, not speaking to each other. The sun was warm on their eyelids. Cicadas sang in the high branches of the gum tree. "Clytie is never, never nice to me," mourned Frances as she drifted off to sleep. She woke suddenly to find Clytie tugging at her arm. "What is it?" "Shut up and listen." Clytie put a finger to her lips. From inside the house came the sound of footsteps and then the bang of the front door. "Mum?" "Course not," said Clytie. "It's too soon. You know she always stays for ages over there. It's Auntie May." "She was asleep." "Well, she's awake now." The gate clanged. Clytie and Frances ran round to the front of the house. Down the street, almost at the corner now, a small figure dressed in mauve was walking rapidly away. "She's got her glad rags on," said Clytie. "I bet she's going to Ethel's place." "Oh, no!" They hurried after her. "Auntie, Auntie!" "Oh, there you are!" Auntie May turned, beaming at them. "You're coming too, are you?" "Coming where?" They held their breaths as they waited for the answer. Perhaps their great-aunt was only going shopping, to the butcher's perhaps, to buy more sausages for Stan's ghostly tea. "To Ethel's place, of course," said Auntie May. Frances swallowed. Clytie said carefully, Ethel might be out." Aunt May laughed. "Not on a Wednesday, dear. Ethel and I always visit on Wednesdays. It is Wednesday, isn't it?" They nodded glumly. It was funny how she always got the day right, even when she'd slipped back half a century. "Hurry up now, or we'll be late. Ethel doesn't like to be kept hanging about." She strode ahead briskly. They lagged behind, whispering to each other. "What'll we do?" fretted Frances. "We can't tell her about Ethel being dead. Not again." This was the bad side of drifting in and out of time, she thought. How an awful thing like losing your very best friend could happen many times, and each time be new and painful again. "She'll start crying in the middle of the street. She'll cry and cry and cry." "Oh, stop fussing," snapped Clytie. "Ethel's house is miles away. It's right up in Banksia town. It's Banksia Street. By the time we get there, she'll have forgotten." "Do you think so?" "Of course." But Clytie's voice sounded strangely uncertain. For such an old lady, Auntie May walked quickly in no time. In no time they were halfway down William Street, passing Frances's school, where Clytie had once gone too, and their mum before her, and even Auntie May long ago when she'd been little, before she'd grown up and married and moved away. "You used to go here, didn't you, Auntie?" asked Clytie conversationally. "Where?" "Here, to our old school." Auntie May stopped walking. Her sharp black eyes scanned the building beside them. The tall, narrow windows facing right onto the street, the sandstone walls, the high-pitched roof with the figures carved beneath. 1881. A soft hum of voices drifted through the open window beside them. Teachers were gathered inside that room, sorting books and planning timetables, writing Tuesday, February 2nd up on all the boards. Auntie May heard those voices and her dark eyes flickered. She'd stepped to the window, grabbed the stone ledge beneath the sill, raised herself on tiptoe and peered inside the room. "Auntie," whispered Frances, "Auntie, what are you doing? Come away." Auntie May took no notice. Her tiny hands gripped the ledge more tiredly. "Witches!" she hissed into the room. The hum of voices ceased. "Auntie!" They grabbed her arms and hustled her off down William Street. Frances looked back once, and there at the window she saw the angry face of her new 6th class teacher, a big, bad-tempered Mrs. Blacklock, blooming like a big purple dahlia above the sill. Mrs. Blacklock would mark her down, Frances knew. Whatever you do, Clytie had warned her, don't get on Blacklock's wrong side at the start, or you'll be on her wrong side all year long. "Auntie, why did you do that?" gasped Frances when they paused for breath at the bottom of the hill. "They were mean to Ethel," replied Auntie May, "downright cruel, just because she had a stammer." "But they weren't the same ones." "Makes no difference," said Aunt May airily. Clytie was grinning. It was all right for her. She didn't have to go back to that school anymore. She didn't have to face Mrs. Blacklock on Tuesday, February 2nd. And there was no chance their auntie would forget about visiting Ethel now, even if Banksia Street was 50 miles away. The glimpse of her old schoolroom had freshened her memory. All the way down William Street, up the Trongate, round the corner onto Hudson Street, she talked of her very best friend, of the parties and picnics they'd been to when they were girls, dances, engagements, weddings. She remembered the dresses they'd worn, the apple green chiffon Auntie May's mum had made for her 16th birthday, Ethel's coral silk with the bodice embroidered with pearls. She spoke of long Saturday afternoons when they washed their hair and curled it and sat out on Ethel's veranda talking about boys. They sounded like Clytie and her best friend Melanie. "We wore Evening in Paris," Aunt May went on. "That was our favourite perfume. It came in a little blue bottle. And that's how Ethel got the idea of going to Paris, see? She said the nights in Paris would be that colour, that sort of violet blue." They were almost at Banksia Street now. "What are we going to do?" whispered Frances, grabbing at her sister's arm. Clytie would know. That's what Frances thought. Clytie would figure out something. Clytie always did. She was the elder and she wasn't ever scared. A few steps ahead of them, Auntie May's voice trilled on happily. "Ethel had such a pash on Harry Glasby. When she saw him, she went all dizzy. I'd have to hold her arm really tightly, otherwise I'd think she'd have flown right up into the air." Clytie shivered. Like me, she thought. Distantly, she heard her sister asking, "What are we going to do?" Now they were turning the corner into Ethel's old street. "It's the house next to the tennis courts," Auntie May told them excitedly. "The big white house with the stained glass picture in the door and the palm tree out the front." She squinted into the distance, shading her eyes from the sun. "Where's that palm tree gone?" Frances shook Clytie's arm. "Tell her!" And then she saw that Clytie's chin was quivering and her eyes had gone really big and shiny, as if she was about to cry. "I can't," said Clytie faintly. "What?" "I just can't. Oh, Frances, she's so old, and you know what, when she was talking about those dresses and how they washed their hair and the way Ethel went all dizzy when she saw Harry Glasby, she sounded like me. You'll have to tell her," finished Clytie. "Me? Please," whispered Clytie. Frances couldn't remember Clytie ever saying please to her before. They'd reached the tennis courts. Next door, the big, shiny windows of the electrical store glared brightly onto the street. Auntie May blinked at them, astonished. "What's happened?" she asked them. "Where's Ethel's house? What's this?" "Now," urged Clytie. "Angels and ministers of grace defend us," recited Frances silently, and then she stepped forward to face her auntie. She thought her voice would tremble or stick down in her throat, but it came out strong and clear. "It's the electrical store, Auntie, the one Dad told you about. It's the shop they built when Ethel sold her house." "Ethel sold her house?" Auntie May turned on them indignantly. "No one told me." "It was only a little while ago, Auntie. She decided suddenly and sold it and moved to Paris. She's living in Paris, Auntie, in a big apartment right next to the scene," finished Clytie, who did something called French culture at school. "Paris!" Auntie May's face lit with pleasure. "The city of love. So she got there, did she? Ethel got to Paris like she always wanted to? Oh, she'll be so happy there." They nodded fiercely. "She is. Just goes to show, doesn't it?" crowed Auntie May. If you hold on long enough, you might get your wish after all. Funny old world, isn't it? Yes. What's that I see? Auntie May was pointing to the window of the electrical store. Something seemed to have caught her attention there. Is that a Calvinator? Oh, she moved closer, peering in through the glass. Ethel was forgotten again for now. Is that a Calvinator? She asked them. See, that model in the corner. It's just the kind I had in mind for Patty. It might be, said Frances, joining her auntie by the window. See, it's got that little freezer at the top. You could make ice cream in it, Auntie. Behind them, a low, keening sound burst suddenly from Clytie. They turned around. Clytie's hands were making strange, small, fretting movements down her sides. We've come out in our swimming costumes, she cried. We've walked all that way through all those streets looking like idiots, with everyone seeing us. Kids from my school. Her voice caught. She stared down at her long, bare feet, raised a hand to touch the sticky blob of her zinc-white, clownish nose. She knew some busybody kid would tell Charlie Grace, for sure. You look lovely, dear, said Auntie May, in that little swimming suit, and so does Frances. She smiled at them sweetly. You're lovely girls. The City of Love, Auntie May told Kenny and Irene over tea. That's where Ethel's living now. She's got herself this grand apartment right next to the scene. Kenny and Irene nodded wordlessly, and their hands got very busy with their knives and forks. The happiness in their old auntie's voice had a strange effect on Frances and Clytie. It was almost as if Auntie May's words might be true, and Ethel really was living in the City of Love, standing at the high windows of her apartment, looking out at the shining waters of the scene. In their room that night, Clytie said to Frances, "That was good what you did." "What did I do?" Telling Auntie May that story about Ethel living in Paris. Clytie was blushing. Her fingers flicked gently at Frances's arm and then flew away. She'd never given her little sister, a compliment before. "It was sort of brave of you," she added in a thick, embarrassed voice. Frances blushed too. "It wasn't anything." Clytie grinned. "Now you'll have to go to Paris," she said in her normal teasing voice. "What?" "Well, Auntie May is going to wonder why Ethel didn't write to her, isn't she? So you'll have to write. You know, that sort of thing. Having a wonderful time in the City of Love. Wish you were here. Love and kisses, Ethel." "And then you'll have to post it from Paris, won't you? So it will have the proper stamps and stuff," Clytie smirked. "That's going to be a really expensive trip. You'd better start saving up." She was joking, of course, thought Frances. She had to be. Very early next morning, Frances was woken by a noisy clatter in the street outside. She kneeled up in bed and peered out through the window. She saw an enormous box, taller than a man, perched on the edge of their front porch. Outside the gate, a big truck was pulling away. "The Calvinator's come," she called across to Clytie. "They've delivered Cousin Patty's new fridge to our place instead of hers." "What?" grumbled Clytie, stirring unwillingly from sleep. She didn't want to wake up, not just yet. She'd been having the marvellous dream about Charlie Grace. "Charlie," she whispered, "Charlie." Frances heard. She knew what that must mean. She leapt from her bed. "Who's Charlie?" she asked excitedly. "Clytie, have you got a boyfriend, Clytie?" Clytie jerked, fully awake. Her sister's eager face was hovering inches from her own. "Get off!" "Is Clytie your boyfriend?" "I don't know what you're talking about," replied Clytie Collie. "I don't know anyone called Charlie." "But you were saying his name. I heard you. It sounded like I thought—" "Well, you thought wrong." Clytie brought the words out sharply, rat-a-tat-tat, like bullets, like gunfire. Frances drew back. It was hard to believe that this was the same Clytie who'd been so nice to her last night. "And don't you go blabbing to Mum," growled Clytie. "Don't you dare. Don't you go telling her I've got a boyfriend, that there's—" The threat in Clytie's voice turned to something very much like pleading. "There's someone called Charlie Grace." Charlie Grace. Frances took a deep, slow breath. It was true then. Clytie did have a boyfriend. She wouldn't blab on her, even though she was longing to sell someone. Her best friend Jeanie, perhaps? Jeanie would be thrilled. But no. "I won't tell," she promised, meeting her sister's disbelieving eyes. "Yes, you will." "No, I won't." "You will." Frances didn't argue anymore. She knew she'd keep Clytie's secret. Keeping secrets was grown up.